Hi, I'm Amber, and if you've ever had your own father look you dead in the eye at a family dinner and declare, "You're not my real daughter, so stop acting like you deserve anything from this family," while your stepmother smirked and your half-siblings nodded in agreement, you'll understand why I didn't say a word in that moment. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a manila envelope, and quietly placed it on the table between the mashed potatoes and the lies. What happened next didn't just change dinner, it changed everything they thought they knew about our family, about me, and about the fortune they'd been planning to split without me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside mansion had always felt too big for our family, but that October evening, it felt suffocating. The dining room where we gathered every month for what my stepmother Delilah called family bonding time was decorated with her usual theatrical flair, crystal chandelier casting shadows on oil paintings of ancestors who weren't mine, mahogany table that could seat 12 but somehow always made me feel like I was eating alone. The irony wasn't lost on me that a house built by my late mother's family money now felt like enemy territory. I should have known something was different when I walked in and saw the way my father Kenneth avoided my eyes. Usually, he'd at least pretend to be glad to see me, asking about my job at the marketing firm in downtown Millbrook, or commenting on my latest apartment hunting adventures. But that night, he sat rigid at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression carved from stone. Delilah had positioned herself at the opposite end, like some sort of queen holding court, her red nails drumming against her wine glass as she surveyed her domain. My half-siblings, Jasper and Melody, flanked their mother like matching bookends. At 22, they had the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove you belong somewhere. Jasper wore his usual smug expression, the one he'd perfected during his brief stint at law school before dropping out to find himself on Daddy's dime. Melody, fresh from her third attempt at getting an art degree, kept shooting me looks that ranged from pity to barely concealed disgust. They'd been having whispered conversations all week. I'd caught fragments during previous visits, words like finally and about time and she'll never see it coming. The tension was thick enough to cut with the sterling silver knives that had belonged to my mother's grandmother. As we ate Delilah's overcooked roast beef and pretended this was a normal family gathering, I kept thinking about the envelope in my purse. 3 weeks of waiting for those results had felt like 3 years. But now that I had them, I wasn't sure I was ready for what they might unleash. "So, Amber," Delilah said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she refilled her wine glass for the third time, your father and I have been talking about the future, about legacy and family structure." I glanced at Kenneth, searching for some sign of the man who used to read me bedtime stories, who taught me to ride a bike in the circular driveway, who promised he'd always protect me after Mom died when I was 8. But that man seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who couldn't even look at his own daughter. "We think it's time for some honesty in this family," Delilah continued, and I noticed how she emphasized the word honesty like it was a weapon she'd been sharpening for months. That's when Kenneth finally spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. "Amber, you need to understand something. You're not my real daughter." The words hit the air like a physical blow. Jasper and Melody exchanged satisfied glances. Delilah's smile grew wider. "What your father is trying to say," Delilah jumped in, clearly having rehearsed this moment, "is that we've done some research, some digging into family history, and certain facts have come to light about your parentage." I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, but something strange happened. Instead of the devastation they were clearly expecting, I felt a cold, clear calm settle over me, because for the first time in months, everything was starting to make sense. "You see," Kenneth continued, his voice gaining strength as if he was finally relieved to say what he'd been thinking, "your mother and we had some problems before you were born. She was secretive, distant, and now, looking at you, it's obvious you don't really fit in this family."
"That's why," Melody chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet, "we think it would be better for everyone if you just stepped back from family affairs, from the business decisions, the inheritance discussions, all of it. Jasper nodded eagerly. It's not personal, Amber. It's just that blood is blood, you know? And if you're not actually Dad's daughter, then you don't really belong here, Delilah finished, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. Nothing personal, of course. We'll always care about you. But family money should stay in the family. Real family. The silence that followed was deafening. They sat there, all four of them, waiting for me to break down, to cry, to beg, to leave quietly like the good little fake daughter they'd painted me to be. Instead, I reached into my purse. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with 3 weeks of anticipation and a lifetime of questions I'd never thought to ask. I placed it gently on the table, right between the crystal water glasses and Delilah's carefully arranged centerpiece. You're absolutely right, I said, my voice steady and clear. It's time for honesty in this family. Kenneth's eyes narrowed. What's that? DNA results, I said simply. Because funny thing is, I've been having some questions about family blood too. The color drained from Delilah's face. Jasper and Melody looked confused, but Kenneth? Kenneth looked like he'd seen a ghost. I had some testing done, I continued, enjoying the way the power in the room was shifting with each word. Comprehensive genetic analysis. Very thorough. Very, revealing. My father's hands started to shake slightly. Amber, what are you talking about? I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Why don't you open it and find out? After all, if I'm not really family, then I guess these results won't matter to any of you. But the way Kenneth's face went white as the tablecloth told me that these results were going to matter very, very much. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly known, was that the envelope didn't just contain my DNA results. It contained something that was about to turn their entire world upside down and prove that sometimes the people who scream loudest about family loyalty are the ones hiding the biggest secrets of all. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up in the Riverside mansion should have felt like a fairy tale, but for me, it always felt more like living in someone else's dream. The sprawling estate sat on 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the wealthy Hillcrest district of Millbrook, where old money whispered through oak trees and new money shouted through oversized fountains. Our house was the kind that appeared in architectural magazines, colonial revival with white columns, wraparound porches, and enough rooms that you could go days without seeing another family member if you wanted to. My mother, Lydia Rosewood, had inherited the property from her grandfather along with the textile fortune that built it. She was Millbrook royalty, the kind of woman who had her picture in the society pages and whose charity galas were talked about for months afterward. I barely remembered her laugh, but I remembered the way she smelled like jasmine and vanilla, and how she used to sneak into my room after Kenneth thought I was asleep to tell me stories about brave princesses who saved themselves. She died in a car accident when I was 8, on a rainy Tuesday evening coming home from one of her board meetings. Kenneth was devastated, or at least that's what I thought at the time. He was 35 then, still young and handsome in that polished way that attracted women like Delilah Thornfield. By the time I turned 10, she had moved in to help with the household, bringing her 6-year-old twins Jasper and Melody with her. Delilah was everything my mother wasn't. Loud where mom was gentle, calculated where mom was generous, cold where mom was warm. She had platinum blonde hair that she touched up religiously every 3 weeks, wore designer clothes that always seemed a size too small, and had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She claimed to be from an old Virginia family, but I'd never seen any evidence of relatives or inherited wealth. What she did have was an uncanny ability to make Kenneth feel like the most important man in the world, especially when she wanted something. The twins were mini versions of their mother, beautiful, entitled, and utterly convinced that the world owed them everything they desired. Jasper had Kenneth's height, but Delilah's calculating nature, while Melody had inherited her mother's looks and dramatic flair. They moved through our house like they owned it, which technically they didn't, but they acted like it was only a matter of time.
Kenneth worked as the CFO of Rosewood Textiles, the company my mother's family had built over 3 generations. After Mom died, her shares went into a trust with me as the beneficiary, but Kenneth managed everything until I turned 25. That was supposed to happen in 6 months, which explained why these monthly family dinners had become increasingly tense over the past year. I worked at Hartwell and Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, making decent money, but nothing compared to the Rosewood wealth that would soon be mine. I lived in a modest apartment in the Arts District, preferring my independence to the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. But every month, Delilah insisted on these family bonding dinners, claiming it was important to maintain traditions. What I didn't realize until recently was that these dinners weren't about bonding. They were reconnaissance missions. Delilah and the twins had been watching me, studying me, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Kenneth had grown more distant over the years, especially after he married Delilah when I was 12. The man who once taught me to fish at our lake house and helped me with algebra homework gradually became someone who barely acknowledged my presence unless Delilah prompted him to. The changes were subtle at first. Family photos were slowly replaced with ones that featured just Kenneth, Delilah, and the twins. My childhood artwork disappeared from the refrigerator. Christmas presents became more generic, less personal. When I graduated college summa cum laude, Kenneth attended the ceremony but left immediately afterward for a business trip with Delilah. But it was the conversations I'd been overhearing that really opened my eyes. Whispered phone calls between Delilah and her lawyer friends about contesting inheritances and proving unworthiness. Late-night discussions between the twins about their future plans for Dad's money and how they'd renovate the mansion once the problem was solved. The problem, I'd realized, was me. Living in Millbrook's elite circles meant everyone knew everyone's business. But it also meant that secrets were currency. I'd grown up hearing whispers about other families, affairs, bankruptcies, children who weren't really children of the men who raised them. I'd never thought those whispers would apply to my own family until 3 weeks ago, when Delilah made an offhand comment about how I didn't really look like Kenneth's side of the family. That's when I decided to get answers. The DNA testing kit arrived discreetly at my office, and I submitted it on a Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break. The waiting period felt eternal. 3 weeks of wondering, of watching Kenneth and Delilah more carefully, of noticing things I'd been blind to for years. The way Kenneth never wanted to discuss my mother's death. How Delilah always steered conversations away from my early childhood. Why there were no baby photos of me with Kenneth, only with my mother. By the time the results arrived, I had a theory. But what I didn't expect was that the truth would be so much more explosive than anything I had imagined. The envelope had been sitting in my apartment for 2 days before I worked up the courage to open it. When I finally did, sitting on my couch with a glass of wine and my mother's jewelry box beside me for moral support, I discovered that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. But it wasn't the lie Delilah and Kenneth thought it was. As I sat in that dining room watching their smug faces as they waited for me to crumble, I couldn't help but smile. They thought they were so clever, setting me up for the ultimate rejection. They thought they'd found the perfect way to cut me out of the inheritance to claim the Rosewood fortune for themselves. What they didn't know was that the DNA results in that envelope were about to prove that I wasn't just Kenneth's daughter. I was the only legitimate heir to everything they'd been plotting to steal, and the real bastard children in the family weren't who any of us thought they were. The first crack in my perfect family facade happened 3 weeks before that dinner, on a gray Thursday morning when I wasn't supposed to be at the mansion at all. I'd driven over to pick up some old photo albums that Delilah claimed she'd found in the attic, pictures of my mother that she said I might want for sentimental reasons. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like sentiment was a disease she was trying not to catch.
I used my key to let myself in through the kitchen entrance, calling out to announce my presence, but the house felt empty. The marble floors echoed my footsteps as I made my way toward the main staircase, passing the formal living room where dust motes danced in shafts of autumn sunlight. That's when I heard voices coming from Kenneth's study. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and I could make out Delilah's sharp whisper and the deeper rumble of my father's voice. "The birthday party is the perfect opportunity. Delilah was saying, her tone urgent and excited. All of Millbrook's elite will be there. We can make the announcement then, in front of everyone who matters. I still think we should wait, Kenneth replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Amber doesn't deserve to be humiliated publicly. Delilah's life was like breaking glass. Oh, Kenneth, you're so soft-hearted. She's been living a lie her entire life. Don't you think she deserves to know the truth about what her precious mother really was? My hand froze on the banister. They were talking about me, about my mother, and about some kind of announcement. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they'd hear it. Besides, Delilah continued, once everyone knows she's not really a Rosewood, the inheritance transfer will be much smoother. The board of directors won't question your decision to redirect the trust funds to your legitimate children. But what if she fights it? Kenneth asked. What if she demands proof? Then we'll give her proof, came a new voice. Jasper, apparently just entering the study. I've been working with Morrison's law firm downtown. They specialize in inheritance disputes. He says cases like this are more common than people think. Wives who stray, children who aren't what they seem. All we need is reasonable doubt about her paternity, and the trust becomes contestable. My legs felt weak. I gripped the banister tighter, trying to process what I was hearing. They weren't just planning to cut me out of the inheritance, they were planning to destroy my mother's memory in the process. The beauty of it, Melody's voice joined the chorus, is that everyone will feel sorry for Dad. Poor Kenneth, deceived by his unfaithful wife, raising another man's child out of the goodness of his heart. He'll look like a saint for letting her stay in the family as long as he did. And once the trust is redirected, Delilah added, her voice practically purring with satisfaction, we can finally make the changes we've been planning. The house renovations, the European vacations, Jasper's new business venture. No more tiptoeing around her feelings or pretending she belongs here. Kenneth sighed heavily. I just never thought it would come to this. When Lydia died, I promised I'd take care of Amber. And you have, Delilah said, soothingly. You've given her 18 years of love and support, but she's not your responsibility anymore, Kenneth. Your real children are your responsibility. Your wife is your responsibility. Mom's right, Dad. Amber's had a good run, but it's time for the real family to take priority. Besides, she's young and healthy. She'll figure something out. I'd heard enough. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the staircase, my mind reeling with the implications of what they'd just revealed. They were going to announce at my 25th birthday party, the event I'd been planning for months, the event where I was supposed to officially take control of my inheritance, that I wasn't Kenneth's biological daughter. But as I drove home to my apartment, my shock began to transform into something else, suspicion. Because if there was one thing I knew about Delilah, it's that she never made a move without being absolutely certain she'd win. She was too calculating, too careful to risk everything on a bluff, which meant she thought she had evidence. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by every photo album, document, and keepsake I had from my childhood. I studied pictures of myself as a baby, looking for resemblances to Kenneth or signs that I belonged to someone else. I examined my birth certificate, medical records, anything that might give me clues about my parentage. The more I looked, the more questions arose. Why were there no photos of Kenneth holding me as a newborn? Why did my baby pictures only show me with my mother? And most strange of all, why did I look so much like the portrait of my great-grandmother Rosewood that hung in the mansion's main hallway? The same portrait that Delilah always complained was too prominent and should be moved to storage. I had my mother's eyes, her delicate bone structure, her auburn hair that caught red highlights in the sun. But I also had something else, a strong jawline and a determined set on my shoulders that I'd always assumed came from Kenneth. Looking at those old photos now, I realized it didn't come from him at all. It came from the Rosewood side of the family.
The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove 2 hours to Millbrook University's medical library. If Delilah was planning to question my paternity, I needed to understand exactly what that meant legally and scientifically.
I spent the day researching DNA testing, inheritance law, and paternity disputes. What I learned was both terrifying and enlightening. Delilah was right about one thing. If there was reasonable doubt about my paternity, the inheritance could be contested. But what she apparently didn't understand was that DNA testing worked both ways. If she wanted to prove I wasn't Kenneth's daughter, she'd need his DNA. And if they were going to make public accusations, I had every right to demand scientific proof. That's when the idea hit me. If they wanted to play games with DNA, I'd give them a game they'd never forget. I ordered the testing kit that afternoon, overnight shipping to my office. But I didn't just order one test. I ordered a comprehensive genetic analysis that would trace my lineage back generations. If Delilah wanted to question my place in the family, I'd find out exactly where I belonged. The waiting period was torture. For 3 weeks, I attended family dinners, smiled at their barely concealed excitement, and watched them plan what they thought would be my downfall. Delilah became increasingly careless with her comments, making snide remarks about family resemblance and blood running true. The twins started talking openly about their post-birthday party plans, as if I'd already been erased from the picture. Kenneth became more distant than ever, avoiding eye contact and keeping conversations strictly surface level. I could see the guilt eating at him, but I could also see his weakness. He'd rather let Delilah destroy me than stand up to her and risk losing his comfortable life. The results arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, in a plain white envelope that felt heavier than it should have. I stared at it for 2 hours before opening it, sitting in my car in the office parking lot, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. When I finally tore open the seal and read the contents, I started laughing. Not the bitter laugh of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed, but the genuine laughter of someone who just realized they held all the cards in a game their opponents thought they were winning. Delilah was absolutely right. DNA testing would solve all our family problems. But not in the way she expected. Not even close. Kenneth's hands trembled as he reached for the manila envelope. The confident patriarch who had delivered his crushing blow just moments before now looked like a man approaching his own execution. Delilah leaned forward in her chair, her red nails gripping her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. The twins exchanged nervous glances, their earlier smugness replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Go ahead," I said softly, my voice carrying across the sudden silence of the dining room. "Open it." Kenneth's fingers fumbled with the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy air. He pulled out the first document, a comprehensive genetic analysis report from Helix Genomics, one of the most respected DNA testing companies in the country. His eyes scanned the first page, and I watched the color drain from his face like water from a broken dam. "What does it say?" Delilah demanded, her voice sharp with barely controlled anxiety. Kenneth's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with something between terror and disbelief. This can't be right." "What can't be right?" Jasper snapped, reaching across the table to grab the papers from his stepfather's shaking hands. His confidence evaporated as he read the results. "No! No! This is impossible!" Melody snatched the document from her twin brother, her perfectly manicured fingers leaving smudges on the pristine white paper. As she read, her face went from confusion to horror to something approaching desperation. "This has to be fake! You made this up somehow!" Delilah lunged for the papers, nearly knocking over her wine glass in the process. Red liquid splashed across the white tablecloth like blood on snow. She read the results once, twice, 3 times, her lips moving silently as if she could change the words by reading them differently. 99.7% probability? Kenneth Radford is confirmed as the biological father of Amber Rosewood. The silence that followed was deafening. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds as the implications of what they just read settled over the room like a funeral shroud. "But that's not the interesting part," I said, enjoying the way they all flinched at the sound of my voice. "Keep reading." Kenneth's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold the papers. Jasper grabbed them back, his face growing paler with each line he read. Extended family genetic markers indicate probability of half-sibling relationship between Jasper Thornfield and Melody Thornfield and subject Amber Rosewood is less than 12%. What does that mean? Delilah shrieked, her composure finally cracking completely. What the hell does that mean?
I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor. It means, Delilah, that I'm not just Kenneth's biological daughter, I'm his only biological child sitting at this table. The impact of my words hit them like a physical blow. Melody started crying, ugly, desperate sobs that shook her whole body. Jasper stared at the papers as if he could will them to say something different. Kenneth looked like he might be having a heart attack. But it was Delilah's reaction that satisfied me the most. The woman who had spent years orchestrating my downfall, who had poisoned my father against me, who had plotted to steal my inheritance, now sat frozen in her chair like a statue of defeat. You see, I continued, my voice calm and steady, when I decided to get DNA testing done, I didn't just test my relationship to Kenneth. I did a full family genetic workup. And what I discovered is that the twins you've been passing off as Kenneth's children for the past 15 years aren't his children at all. That's impossible, Delilah whispered, but her voice lacked any conviction. Kenneth is their father. He has to be. The genetic markers don't lie, I said, pulling out a second set of documents from the envelope. I also had their DNA tested. You remember that dinner 2 months ago when you insisted we all try those new vitamin supplements? Well, I saved Jasper and Melody's water glasses. Amazing what modern science can do with just a few cells from saliva residue. Jasper's face went white. You can't do that. That's illegal. Actually, it's not, I said. DNA found in discarded items in a private home is considered abandoned property. I checked with a lawyer. Very thoroughly. Kenneth finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. Delilah, tell me this isn't true. Tell me Jasper and Melody are my children. Delilah's facade crumbled completely. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. Kenneth, I can explain. It's not what you think. So they're not my children, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. The twins I've been supporting, paying for, loving for 15 years aren't mine. You don't understand, Delilah sobbed. I was going to tell you. I thought, if you never knew, it wouldn't matter. You love them. They love you. But you were perfectly willing to destroy Amber based on lies about her parentage? You were ready to steal her inheritance, ruin her reputation, and cast her out of the family, all while knowing that your own children were the illegitimate ones. Melody looked up from her crying long enough to glare at me with pure hatred. You planned this. You knew what would happen tonight. I suspected. When I heard your mother's plan to question my paternity, I realized she was projecting. People who live with big lies are often the first to accuse others of lying. But I never imagined the irony would be this perfect. Kenneth stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward and hitting the floor with a crash that echoed through the mansion. 15 years, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and devastation. 15 years of believing I had a son and daughter, 15 years of loving children who weren't mine, while you convinced me to doubt the one child who actually was? Kenneth, please, Delilah begged, reaching for him. We can work through this. The twins still need you. I still love you. He jerked away from her touch like she was radioactive. Love? You call this love? You've been lying to me since the day we met. Worse than lying, you've been stealing from my real daughter while convincing me she didn't deserve my love. Who's their real father? I asked quietly. The question that everyone was thinking, but no one had dared to voice.
Delilah's sobs intensified. Through her tears, she managed to choke out a name. Richard Morrison. Kenneth's face went from white to purple. The lawyer? The one who's been helping you plan to contest Amber's inheritance? The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't just been Delilah's legal advisor. He'd been her partner in more ways than one. The man helping her steal my inheritance was the biological father of the children she'd been trying to position as heirs. "That's why you were so confident," I said, understanding flooding through me. "Morrison wasn't just your lawyer. He was your co-conspirator, the father of your children, and your partner in fraud." Jasper finally found his voice. "We didn't know. Melody and we had no idea. We thought Kenneth was our father." I looked at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. Without the arrogance and entitlement, he just looked like a scared 22-year-old who'd built his entire identity on a lie. "Maybe you didn't know about the DNA, but you knew you were trying to steal my inheritance. You knew you were plotting to humiliate me publicly. Don't pretend you're innocent victims here."
Kenneth walked around the table slowly, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. When he reached my chair, he stopped and looked down at me. "Amber, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately give. I let her poison me against you. I let her convince me to doubt the one person in this family who deserved my protection." "Yes," I said simply. "You did." The honesty of my response seemed to hit him harder than any accusation could have. He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of his failures. "What happens now?" Melody asked through her tears. I looked around the table at the family that had just tried to destroy me, the people who had spent months planning my humiliation and disinheritance, the people who were now revealed as the frauds they'd accused me of being. "Now," I said, standing up and smoothing down my dress, "you're going to learn what real consequences look like. And I'm going to make sure that everyone who is supposed to witness my downfall at the birthday party gets to see the truth instead." I picked up my purse and the DNA results, leaving the family sitting in the wreckage of their lives. As I walked toward the door, I could hear Delilah's sobs echoing behind me, but I didn't look back. Some bridges aren't worth saving. Some families aren't worth fighting for. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let the truth burn everything down so something honest can grow in its place. I drove through the winding streets of Hillcrest in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel while my mind reeled from what had just transpired. The familiar route to my apartment had never felt so foreign, as if the DNA revelation had shifted the very landscape of my world. Street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement, and I found myself taking the long way home, needing time to process the magnitude of what I'd just unleashed. My phone started buzzing before I had even reached the main road. Kenneth's name flashed across the screen, followed immediately by 3 missed calls from Delilah. I let them go to voicemail, not ready to hear their desperate attempts at damage control. The silence in my car felt sacred after the chaos of that dining room, and I wasn't about to break it for their panic. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the modest building that had been my sanctuary for the past 3 years. The contrast between my simple one-bedroom apartment and the mansion I'd just left felt sharper than ever. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built independently, suddenly seemed small in comparison to what I was about to inherit. But more than that, I realized I was about to lose the last vestiges of the family I thought I knew. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt endless. Mrs. Chen from 4B was watering her plants in the hallway, and she smiled at me with the same neighborly warmth she always showed me. But I felt like I was wearing a mask, pretending to be the same person who had left for dinner that evening. How do you explain to someone that you've just discovered your entire family has been living a lie? That the people you thought were trying to steal from you were actually stealing from someone else entirely? Inside my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my own space.
The walls were decorated with my mother's paintings, landscapes she'd done during her art therapy sessions after losing her first pregnancy, the one that happened 2 years before I was born. I'd always found those paintings soothing, but tonight they felt like messages from beyond the grave. My phone buzzed with a text from Kenneth. "Please call me. We need to talk about what happens next." What happens next? The question I'd been avoiding since I walked out of that mansion. Because now that the truth was out, now that I detonated the bomb that destroyed their carefully constructed lies, I had to face the consequences of my actions. And more terrifyingly, I had to decide what I wanted those consequences to be. The voicemails were a symphony of desperation. Kenneth's voice was shaky and uncertain. "Amber, sweetheart, I know I have no right to ask, but please don't do anything hasty. Let's sit down and figure this out together." Delilah's messages grew increasingly frantic with each call. "You don't understand the full situation. There are things you don't know. Please, just give me a chance to explain." But the text from Jasper stopped me cold. My whole life is a lie. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about our family, about who I am, it's all fake. I don't even know what my real last name should be.
For the first time since leaving the mansion, I felt a stab of something that might have been guilt. Jasper and Melody hadn't chosen to be born into Delilah's web of lies. They'd grown up believing Kenneth was their father, believing they'd belonged in that house, believing they had a right to the Rosewood inheritance. In destroying Delilah's plans, I'd also destroyed their entire sense of identity. But then I remembered the gleeful way they'd discussed cutting me out of the family, the casual cruelty with which they'd planned to humiliate me at my own birthday party. Sympathy was one thing. Allowing myself to be victimized again was another entirely. I opened my laptop and began researching inheritance law more thoroughly than I had before. Now that I knew the truth about the twins' parentage, I needed to understand exactly what this meant legally. What I discovered was both liberating and overwhelming. Not only was I Kenneth's sole biological heir, but the twins had no legal claim to the Rosewood inheritance at all. The trust my mother had established was specifically for her descendants, and DNA testing would prove conclusively that Jasper and Melody weren't related to her in any way. More importantly, I learned that what Delilah and Morrison had been planning, knowingly presenting false heirs to claim an inheritance, constituted inheritance fraud, a felony that could result in both criminal charges and civil liability. They hadn't just been planning to steal from me, they'd been planning to commit a serious crime. The implications were staggering. I had the power to not only reclaim my inheritance, but to potentially send Delilah and Morrison to prison. The question was, did I want to use that power? Around midnight, I checked my email, hoping for some distraction from the endless loop of thoughts in my head. Instead, I found a message that made my blood run cold. It was from Morrison's law firm, timestamped just 2 hours after I'd left the mansion. The subject line read, "Emergency cease and desist, Amber Rosewood." My hands trembled as I opened the email. Morrison was demanding that I stop spreading false and defamatory information about his clients. He threatened legal action if I shared the DNA results with anyone, claiming they were obtained illegally and would not be admissible in court. The email was clearly written in haste, full of legal jargon that barely concealed panic, but the message was clear. They were going to fight. I laughed out loud, a sound that echoed strangely in my quiet apartment. Morrison was so desperate to cover his tracks that he was making threats before he'd even seen the evidence against him. He had no idea that I'd been careful to obtain the DNA samples legally, or that I'd already consulted with a lawyer about the admissibility of the results. He was flailing blindly, which meant he was scared. My phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize, a local area code but not one in my contacts. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Amber Rosewood?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Sarah Blackwell. I'm an investigative journalist with the Millbrook Herald.
I received an interesting tip tonight about some family drama involving the Rosewood textile fortune. Would you be interested in commenting? My heart stopped. Someone had already leaked the story to the press. Who gave you this tip? I can't reveal my sources, but I can tell you that someone is very eager to make sure your side of the story gets told. Apparently, there's been some question about inheritance fraud and false paternity claims. I closed my eyes, trying to think through the implications. If the story was going to come out anyway, I had a choice. Let someone else control the narrative, or make sure the truth was told completely and accurately. Miss Blackwell, I said slowly, if I were to speak with you, would you be interested in seeing documented proof of everything I'm about to tell you? Absolutely. When would you like to meet? I looked around my apartment one more time, at the peaceful life I'd built, at the independence I'd fought for, at the simple existence that was about to become incredibly complicated. Tomorrow morning, I said, 9 a.m. And Miss Blackwell, bring a photographer. The birthday party Delilah Thornfield was planning to humiliate me at is scheduled for this Saturday. I think it's time Millbrook Society learned what really happens when you try to steal someone's legacy. As I hung up the phone, I realized I just crossed another line. There would be no quiet resolution, no private family meeting to sort things out. I just declared war, and I was going to fight it in the court of public opinion.
For the first time in my life, I was about to discover what it felt like to have real power. And I was going to use every bit of it to make sure that the people who tried to destroy me would never be able to hurt anyone else the same way. The scared, compliant daughter they thought they knew was gone forever. What they were about to face was someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Sarah Blackwell arrived at my apartment the next morning carrying a leather messenger bag and the kind of intense energy that made me understand why she'd become Millbrook's most respected investigative journalist. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp green eyes and prematurely gray hair that she wore like a badge of honor. Her photographer, a quiet man named Marcus, who looked like he'd seen everything twice, set up his equipment in my living room while Sarah spread documents across my coffee table like she was preparing for war. "Before we start," she said, pulling out a digital reporter, "I need you to understand that once this story runs, there's no taking it back. Millbrook Society thrives on scandal, but they also destroy people who embarrass them. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Delilah's smug face when she'd planned my humiliation, about Kenneth's weakness in letting her manipulate him, about the twins' casual cruelty. "I'm prepared," I said. "But first, let me show you something that makes the story even bigger than you think." I handed her the DNA results, but also something I hadn't shared with anyone yet, a manila folder I'd retrieved from my mother's safety deposit box the night before. Sarah's eyebrows rose as she examined the contents. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, holding up a private investigator's report dated 15 years ago. "Your mother hired someone to investigate Delilah before she married your father?" The report was thorough and damning. My mother had suspected something was wrong when Delilah suddenly appeared in Kenneth's life with her twin children claiming to be recently widowed. The investigator had discovered that Delilah had never been legally married to anyone named Thornfield. Her real name was Delilah Morrison. She was Richard Morrison's sister-in-law, and the twins were actually his children from an affair with a woman named Crystal Vaughn, who had died in a drug overdose when the twins were 4. "So Morrison isn't just their biological father," Sarah said, her voice growing excited. "He's been their guardian all along, and Delilah is his sister-in-law who helped him place the children with your father for financial support." But that wasn't the most shocking revelation in the folder. The investigator had also uncovered evidence that Delilah and Morrison had run this exact same con before, in Richmond, Virginia. They'd targeted a recently widowed businessman named Harold Westbrook, with Delilah playing the grieving single mother while Morrison handled the legal maneuvering. They'd successfully convinced Westbrook to include the twins in his will before his suspicious death from a medication overdose that was ruled accidental. "They've done this before," I said, my voice hollow. "My mother figured it out, but she died before she could expose them."
Sarah's photographer was quietly documenting everything, his camera clicking steadily as he captured the evidence spread across my table. Sarah held up another document from the folder, a draft letter my mother had written to the FBI's white-collar crime division, describing her suspicions about Delilah and Morrison's activities. She was going to turn them in, Sarah said. The date on this letter is 1 week before her accident. The word accident hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I'd always accepted that my mother's death was a tragic coincidence. A rainy night, slick roads, a telephone pole that appeared out of nowhere. But looking at the evidence she'd gathered, seeing how close she'd come to exposing their criminal enterprise, I couldn't ignore the possibility that her death hadn't been random at all. "We need to contact the Richmond police," Sarah said, already pulling out her phone. "If Westbrook's death was suspicious and your mother was about to expose them, you think they killed her?" The words came out flat, emotionless, because the alternative, feeling the full weight of that possibility, would have destroyed me right there on my living room floor. "I think your mother discovered something that made her dangerous to them, and 3 days later, she was dead. I also think Harold Westbrook's family deserves to know what really happened to their father." Sarah spent the next hour making calls, while I sat numbly on my couch trying to process the scope of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just about inheritance fraud or false paternity claims. This was about a criminal conspiracy that had potentially cost 2 people their lives and stolen millions of dollars from multiple families. Her first call was to Detective Raymond Foster with the Richmond PD, who remembered the Westbrook case. "Always felt hinky," he told Sarah over speakerphone. "Healthy 60-year-old man with no history of medication errors suddenly overdoses on heart pills he'd been taking safely for years? But the new wife and stepchildren were devastated, never asked any questions, just wanted to grieve privately." The new wife, of course, had been Delilah Morrison, though she'd used the name Delilah Westbrook during her brief marriage. The stepchildren had been Jasper and Melody, who'd inherited $2 million when Westbrook died, money that had mysteriously disappeared into overseas accounts within 6 months. Sarah's second call was to the FBI field office in Richmond. Agent Patricia Novak was immediately interested when Sarah mentioned the connection between 2 suspicious deaths, inheritance fraud, and a pattern of targeting wealthy widowers. "We've been looking for something exactly like this," Agent Novak said. "Send me everything you have. If there's a pattern here, we need to stop it before it happens again." By noon, my apartment had become the headquarters of a federal investigation. Agent Novak arrived with 2 other agents and a digital forensic specialist who began examining the evidence with the kind of methodical precision that made me understand why people feared federal investigators. They photographed every document, scanned every page, and asked questions that revealed connections I hadn't even considered. "The timing of your 25th birthday isn't coincidental," Agent Novak explained as she reviewed the trust documents. "That's when you gain full control of the inheritance. If they'd succeeded in having you declared illegitimate, the trust would have been dissolved and the assets would have reverted to your father. Given his obvious manipulation by Mrs. Morrison, those assets would have effectively been under their control." "How much money are we talking about?" the forensic specialist asked. I swallowed hard. "The textile company is worth approximately $47 million. The real estate holdings add another $12 million. Plus investment accounts, art collections, and other assets, total value is probably close to $70 million. Agent Novak whistled softly. $70 million is worth killing for, especially for people who've apparently done it before. The forensic specialist had been running searches on Morrison's law firm during our conversation. "Richard Morrison has represented clients in suspicious inheritance cases in 4 different states over the past 20 years, always involving wealthy widowers, always involving sudden deaths that were ruled accidental, and always resulting in substantial payouts to previously unknown beneficiaries." "How many people do you think they've killed?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. We'll know more once we coordinate with other jurisdictions, Agent Novak said. But based on what we're seeing here, we could be looking at a serial inheritance fraud scheme spanning 2 decades. Sarah had been quiet during most of the federal agent's questioning, but now she spoke up. What about the birthday party? It's tomorrow night. Are you going to arrest them? Agent Novak shook her head. We need more evidence before we can make arrests, but we're going to have undercover agents at that party, and we're going to let them proceed with their plan. Sometimes the best way to catch criminals is to let them commit the crime while you're watching. You want me to go to my own humiliation party? I asked incredulously. We want you to go to your vindication party, Agent Novak corrected. Because when Delilah Morrison stands up in front of Millbrook's elite and accuses you of being illegitimate, we're going to have federal agents recording every word. And when she presents forged documents to support her claims, we're going to arrest her for inheritance fraud in front of everyone who matters in this town. The thought of Delilah being arrested at the party she'd planned to destroy me was almost too perfect to believe. What about Morrison? He'll be there too, won't he? As their lawyer, presenting the legal case for why you should be disinherited? Agent Novak smiled grimly. We'll get him at the same time. As the federal agents packed up their evidence and prepared to leave, Sarah pulled me aside. Are you ready for what's going to happen tomorrow night? Because once this story breaks, your life is never going to be the same. I looked around my modest apartment, at the simple life I'd built, at the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain. Tomorrow night, I'd become one of the wealthiest women in Millbrook, but I'd also become the woman who brought down a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for 20 years.
My life already changed the moment I opened that DNA report, I said. Tomorrow night, I'm just going to find out who I really am when I stop letting other people define me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I was actually looking forward to my birthday party. The morning of my birthday party, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word was spreading through Millbrook's social circles like wildfire, though no one seemed to know exactly what was happening, just that something explosive was planned for the evening's festivities. Sarah's article wouldn't run until after the party, but rumors had a way of traveling faster than facts in a town where gossip was considered a competitive sport. My first call was from Rebecca Hartwell, my boss at the marketing firm, and one of the few people in Millbrook who'd always treated me as more than just the Rosewood girl. Rebecca had built her agency from nothing, and she understood what it meant to fight for respect in a town that valued bloodlines over ability. Amber, honey, whatever you're planning tonight, I want you to know you have my full support, she said, without preamble. I've been watching that family treat you like hired help for years, and it's about time someone stood up to them. Rebecca, there are things about tonight that I can't explain yet, but I might need some professional help in the coming weeks. Legal representation, public relations, that kind of thing. Already handled, she said. I called my lawyer this morning, Amanda Foster, best inheritance attorney in the state. She's standing by for whatever you need, and my PR team is ready to manage any media fallout. The Hartwell Agency takes care of our own. My second ally came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, my mother's former best friend, and the head of pediatrics at Millbrook General Hospital, called around noon. I hadn't spoken to her since my mother's funeral, but her voice carried the same warmth I remembered from childhood. Amber, I've been carrying a burden for 15 years, and I think it's time you knew the truth. Your mother came to see me the week before she died. She was scared, honey. Really scared. She'd discovered something about Delilah and that lawyer, and she was afraid for your safety. Dr. Warner arranged to meet me at the hospital, away from prying eyes and potential surveillance. When I arrived at her office, she handed me a sealed envelope that my mother had left with her for safekeeping. She made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to her, Dr. Warner explained. I've been wondering all these years if I should have opened it myself, but she was very specific. Only you, and only if she couldn't tell you herself. Inside the envelope was a letter in my mother's handwriting dated 3 days before her death. My dearest Amber, if you're reading this, then my fears have come true, and I'm no longer here to protect you.
I've discovered that Delilah and Richard Morrison are not who they claim to be. They've done this before, and I believe they killed Harold Westbrook in Richmond. I've hidden evidence in 3 locations: the safety deposit box you already know about, a storage unit in Old Town, key taped under your bedroom windowsill, and with Thomas Ashford at First National Bank. Trust Dr. Warner, trust the Hartwells, but trust no one else until this is over. You are stronger than you know, and you have more allies than you realize. Fight for what's yours, but more importantly, fight for the truth. All my love, Mum. Dr. Warner wiped tears from her eyes as I finished reading. She knew, didn't she? She knew they were going to kill her. It looks that way, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Dr. Warner, would you be willing to testify to what my mother told you? The FBI is building a case, and your testimony could be crucial. Absolutely. That woman destroyed your family, and if she's responsible for Lydia's death, she needs to pay for it. My third stop was First National Bank, where Thomas Ashford, the senior vice president, had worked with the Rosewood family for over 30 years. He was a dignified man in his 60s who remembered my mother with obvious fondness. Your mother was one of the smartest people I ever knew, he said as he led me to a private conference room. She set up multiple safeguards to protect the family assets, including some that I don't think even your father knows about. Thomas showed me documents that revealed the true scope of my inheritance. The $70 million I'd known about was just the beginning. My mother had established a network of offshore accounts, real estate holdings in 4 countries, and investment portfolios that had grown substantially over the past 15 years. The total value of the Rosewood estate was closer to $120 million.
But that's not the most important thing she left you, Thomas continued, pulling out a thick legal document. This is an irrevocable trust that she established specifically to protect against inheritance fraud. Even if someone successfully challenged your legitimacy, which they can't based on what you've shown me, the trust would transfer to a backup beneficiary of your mother's choosing. Who's the backup beneficiary? Thomas smiled. The Lydia Rosewood Foundation for Victims of Domestic Violence and Financial Abuse. Your mother was very specific. If anyone tried to steal from you, they'd end up funding a charity dedicated to helping people exactly like yourself. I laughed despite everything. Even from beyond the grave, my mother was still protecting me and planning for justice. My fourth ally was someone I never expected. Harold Westbrook's daughter, Patricia Westbrook Chen, who lived in California but had flown in specifically for tonight's confrontation. Agent Novak had contacted her after discovering the connection between our cases, and Patricia had insisted on being present when Delilah and Morrison were arrested. "I've been waiting 15 years for justice for my father," she said when we met at my apartment that afternoon. "I always knew something was wrong about his death, but I was 23 and didn't know how to fight people with money and lawyers. When Agent Novak called and explained what you discovered, I realized we could finally get the truth." Patricia brought her own evidence, financial records showing how Delilah and the twins had systematically drained her father's accounts after his death, medical records that raised questions about his medication overdose, and, most importantly, a recording her father had made on his phone the night before he died. "I found this on his cell phone after the funeral," she explained, playing the audio. Harold Westbrook's voice was shaky but clear. "If something happens to me, look into Delilah and the lawyer Morrison. I think they're planning something. I've been having chest pains since they started bringing me new medications, and Delilah keeps asking about my will. I'm scared, but I don't know who to trust." The recording was devastating evidence of premeditated murder, and it would be crucial in building the federal case against them. My final preparation came from an unexpected source, Kenneth himself. Around 4 in the afternoon, he appeared at my apartment looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes were red from what looked like a combination of crying and drinking. "Amber, I need to tell you something," he said without preamble.
I've been a coward and a fool, but I'm not going to let them destroy you the way they destroyed your mother. Kenneth revealed that he'd been secretly recording conversations with Delilah for the past 2 days, using his phone to capture her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain their story. The recordings included her admitting that the twins weren't his children, that she'd forged documents to support their inheritance claims, and most damning of all, that she and Morrison had handled problems before and would handle this one too. She's planning something for tonight, Kenneth mourned. Not just the public humiliation. She and Morrison have been meeting privately, and I heard her mention something about permanent solutions and accidents happen. I think they're planning to hurt you, Amber. I immediately called Agent Novak, who arranged for additional security at the party and instructed me to wear a wire to capture any threats Delilah or Morrison might make. As the sun began to set on what was supposed to be my 25th birthday celebration, I stood in my apartment surrounded by evidence, allies, and federal agents preparing for what would either be my complete vindication or my last night alive. The scared, isolated young woman who'd walked out of that family dinner 2 days ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real power came not from money or bloodlines, but from truth and the courage to fight for it. The birthday party Delilah had planned as my public execution was about to become her own funeral instead. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my family anymore. They should have been afraid of me. At 5:47 p.m., exactly 3 hours before my birthday party was scheduled to begin, my apartment building's fire alarm started blaring. The piercing sound echoed through the hallways as residents poured out of their units, confused and annoyed. I was in my bedroom getting ready when the alarm started, and something about the timing felt wrong. Too convenient, too perfectly timed to disrupt my final preparations. Agent Novak's voice crackled through my wire as I grabbed my purse and headed for the stairs. Amber, this could be a diversion. Stay with the crowd. Don't go anywhere alone. Outside in the parking lot, Fire Chief Rodriguez was arguing with the building management about the alarm system malfunction. No signs of fire, no smoke, no heat signatures. Looks like someone manually triggered the system from the basement access panel.
While everyone milled around waiting for the all clear, I noticed a familiar black sedan parked across the street, Morrison's car. He was sitting behind the wheel, talking intently on his phone, occasionally glancing toward our building. When he spotted me looking at him, he quickly drove away, but not before I caught sight of someone in the passenger seat. Delilah. "They're watching me," I whispered into my wire. "And they triggered that alarm deliberately." Agent Novak's response was immediate. "We're moving up the timeline. Get back inside, pack whatever you need, and we're transferring you to a safe house until the party." But as we climbed back up to my apartment, I discovered why they'd really triggered that alarm. My front door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it. Inside, my apartment had been professionally searched, not ransacked like a burglary, but methodically examined by someone who knew what they were looking for. Drawers had been opened and carefully closed, my laptop was in a slightly different position, and my mother's jewelry box had been moved. "They were looking for something specific," Agent Novak said as her team dusted for fingerprints. "What did you have here that they'd want?" That's when I realized what was missing. The storage unit key that my mother had hidden under my bedroom windowsill. I had retrieved it yesterday and left it on my nightstand. It was gone. "The third location," I said, my blood running cold. "My mother hid evidence in 3 places. They figured out about the storage unit." Agent Novak was already on her radio, dispatching a team to Old Count Storage, but I knew we were too late. By the time we arrived at the facility, Unit 247 had been emptied. The lock had been cut, and whatever my mother had hidden there was gone. The storage facility manager, an elderly man named Pete, was visibly shaken. "2 people came by about an hour ago," he said, "had a key and said they were cleaning out a deceased relative's unit. I didn't think anything of it until they loaded up a whole truck with boxes and files." "Did you get a license plate?" Agent Novak asked. "Better than that," Pete said, leading us to his security office. "Got them on camera." The surveillance footage showed Delilah and Morrison systematically loading boxes into a white rental truck.
But what made my heart sink was seeing them carry out several banker's boxes and what looked like a safe. Whatever evidence my mother had hidden, they now had it. But the day's sabotage wasn't over. At 6:30 p.m., as I was getting dressed at the FBI safe house, my phone rang with a call from the Grandview Country Club's event coordinator. Miss Rosewood, I'm so sorry to call with such short notice, but we've had to cancel tonight's event. There's been a problem with the catering company, and we've discovered some issues with the venue's insurance. What kind of issues? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Well, your stepmother called this morning and informed us that there might be some family disputes tonight. She suggested that hosting the party could expose the club to liability issues. Our legal department recommended cancellation. I put the call on speaker so Agent Novak could hear. Did Mrs. Morrison offer an alternative venue? Actually, yes. She's arranged for the party to be moved to the Morrison estate in Winchester. She said it would be more private for family matters. Winchester was 30 miles outside of Millbrook in a rural area with limited cell service and only one road in and out. If they'd moved the party there, they'd effectively isolated me from help and put me on their home turf. Agent Novak shook her head grimly. It's a trap. They're trying to get you somewhere they can control the situation completely. But that's when I realized they'd made a critical mistake. Actually, I said, smiling for the first time all day, they've just made this easier for us. I called Rebecca Hartwell, who'd been coordinating with the guest list all week. Rebecca, I need you to contact everyone invited to tonight's party. Tell them there's been a venue change, but not to Winchester. Tell them the party is now being held at the Riverside mansion, my family home. Are you sure about that? Agent Novak asked. That's exactly where they'd expect you to go. Exactly. But it's also where I have every legal right to be, where all the evidence is hidden, and where they'll have to make their move in front of witnesses they can't control. My next call was to Kenneth, who answered on the first ring. Amber, thank God. Delilah has been in a panic all day. She and Morrison have been moving things out of the house, burning papers in the backyard, and making phone calls in languages I don't recognize. Kenneth, I need you to do exactly what I say. Call Delilah and tell her I've agreed to attend the party at the Riverside mansion. Tell her I want to settle this family matter privately, without lawyers or outside interference. Can you do that?
Yes, but Amber, it's not safe. I heard Morrison talking about cleaning up loose ends and making sure there are no witnesses to complicate things. There will be witnesses, I assured him. More than they bargained for. Agent Novak had been coordinating with her team during my calls. We'll have agents positioned around the property. But if you go inside that house, you're going to be vulnerable. They've had all day to prepare whatever they're planning. Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance to use it. At 7:15 p.m., I received a text message from an unknown number. Stop fighting this. Take the money we're offering and disappear. This is your last chance to walk away. I showed the message to Agent Novak, who immediately had her tech team trace the number. Burner phone purchased this morning with cash, but the cell tower data shows it originated from the Winchester area. They're not even at the mansion, I realized. They're trying to get me to go there alone while they wait at their backup location. That's when Morrison himself called. His voice was cold and professional, but I could hear the underlying panic. Amber, I think there's been some confusion about tonight's events. Given the family circumstances, perhaps it would be better if we postponed the celebration and met privately to discuss the inheritance situation. I think tonight is perfect, I said, making sure my wire picked up every word. In fact, I insist we proceed as planned. I have some family history to share that I think everyone will find fascinating. Morrison's pause was telling. I'm not sure that's wise. Family matters should be kept private. Oh, don't worry, I said sweetly. Everything I plan to share tonight has been thoroughly documented and verified. I'm sure a lawyer of your caliber will appreciate the attention to legal detail.
After I hung up, Agent Novak looked at me with something approaching admiration. You just backed them into a corner. Now they have to show up tonight or risk looking guilty by running. Exactly. And when they do show up, they'll be walking into the biggest trap of their criminal careers. As we finalized the evening's plans, I felt the last of my fear drain away, replaced by a cold, focused determination. Delilah and Morrison had spent the day trying to sabotage me, intimidate me, and isolate me. Instead, they'd forced me to become exactly the kind of opponent they should have feared from the beginning, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by destroying them completely. Tonight, they would learn the difference between being a victim and being a survivor, and I was going to make sure it was a lesson they never forgot. At exactly 8 p.m., I pulled into the circular driveway of the Riverside mansion for what I knew would be the last time as Kenneth's unsuspecting daughter. The house was blazing with lights, every window glowing like a beacon that could be seen for miles across Millbrook's rolling hills. Cars lined the driveway. Mercedes, BMWs, Jaguars. The vehicles of Millbrook's elite, who'd come to expecting to witness my social execution and were about to see something far more explosive. Agent Novak's voice crackled through my earpiece as I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. Remember, we need them to make the accusations publicly before we move in. Let them hang themselves with their own words. I was wearing my mother's emerald necklace and the black dress she'd worn to her last charity gala, the one in the portrait that hung in the mansion's main hallway. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Tonight, Lydia Rosewood's daughter was coming home to claim what was rightfully hers. Inside, the mansion had been transformed into what Delilah clearly intended to be a stage for my humiliation. She'd arranged the furniture in the main parlor to create a presentation area, complete with a microphone and a large screen that presumably would display whatever fraudulent evidence she'd prepared. About 60 people mingled throughout the downstairs rooms. Judges, business leaders, society matrons, and old family friends who'd known my mother. Everyone who mattered in Millbrook was here to witness what they thought would be my downfall. Delilah greeted me at the door wearing a triumphant smile and a red dress that was just expensive enough to suggest she was already spending my inheritance. Amber, darling, I'm glad you decided to join us after all. Kenneth was worried you might not show up for your own party. I wouldn't miss it for the world, I said, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she led me into the parlor. I have some family history to share that I think everyone will find fascinating.
Jasper and Melody flanked their mother like bodyguards, but they looked nervous rather than confident. Jasper's usual smirk was replaced by a tight lip expression, and Melody kept glancing towards the exits as if planning escape routes. They knew something had gone wrong with their mother's plan, but they didn't know what. Morrison is holding court near the fireplace, regaling a group of local attorneys with stories of his recent victories in inheritance disputes. But when he saw me enter, his jovial expression faltered. He excused himself from the group and made his way over to Delilah, whispering urgently in her ear. Kenneth appeared at my side, looking haggard but determined. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "Your mother would be proud too." Judge Harrison Blackwood, the most respected jurist in the county and a longtime family friend, approached with Patricia Westbrook Chen, who'd blown in specifically for tonight's revelations. "Amber, my dear, you look radiant," Judge Blackwood said. "Patricia here has been telling me some fascinating stories about inheritance fraud cases. Apparently, there's been quite an epidemic of such crimes in recent years." Patricia smiled grimly. "It's amazing how these criminals always follow the same pattern. Target wealthy widowers, plant illegitimate children in the family, eliminate anyone who discovers the truth." Morrison, who'd been eavesdropping on our conversation, suddenly appeared beside us. "Patricia, isn't it? I remember you from the Westbrook estate proceedings. Such a tragic loss, your father. Heart medication can be so unpredictable." Patricia's eyes flashed with anger, but she maintained her composure. "Yes,
especially when someone tampers with the dosage. But fortunately, modern forensic science has ways of detecting such tampering, even years later. The color drained from Morrison's face. He just realized that Harold Westbrook's body could be exhumed and tested for evidence of poisoning. Delilah chose that moment to call for everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could gather in the parlor, we have some important family announcements to make. The crowd assembled expectantly, wine glasses in hand, settling into chairs and standing along the walls. Delilah positioned herself in front of the large screen, with Morrison flanking her like a legal advisor. Kenneth stood off to the side, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Thank you all for coming to celebrate what we thought was Amber's 25th birthday. However, recent family discoveries have made it necessary to address some complications regarding inheritance and family legitimacy. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Judge Blackwood leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave but interested. You see, Delilah continued, clicking a remote to display what appeared to be DNA test results on the screen, we've discovered that Amber is not Kenneth's biological daughter. She has been living a lie, benefiting from a fortune that rightfully belongs to Kenneth's legitimate children. The screen showed fabricated DNA results claiming to prove that Kenneth was not my father. The documents were professionally prepared, but contained several scientific errors that would be obvious to anyone who understood genetic testing. Dr. Warner, who was sitting in the front row, raised her hand. Excuse me, but I'm a physician with extensive experience in genetic testing. These results show several inconsistencies that suggest falsification. Delilah's confident smile wavered. I'm sure there's some confusion about the technical details. There's no confusion, I said, standing up and walking to the front of the room, because I have the real DNA results right here. I pulled out the legitimate test results and handed them to Dr. Warner, who examined them carefully before passing them to Judge Blackwood. According to these official results from Helix Genomics, Kenneth Redford is confirmed as Amber's biological father with 99.7% certainty. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Delilah's face went white, but she pressed on desperately. Even if that's true, she said, her voice rising with panic, Kenneth has other children who deserve consideration in inheritance matters. Jasper and Melody Thornfield have been part of this family for 15 years. But they're not Kenneth's children, I said calmly. The same DNA analysis proves that Jasper and Melody Thornfield are not related to Kenneth or to me. Morrison stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. These accusations are slanderous and legally actionable. I demand that this gathering be disbanded immediately. Actually, said Judge Blackwood, standing up with the authority of 30 years on the bench, I think we should hear what other evidence young Amber has to present. In particular, I'm interested in learning more about this pattern of inheritance fraud that seems to be connected to recent events. Patricia Westbrook Chen took that as her cue. She stood up and addressed the room with the poise of someone who'd been waiting 15 years for this moment.
My name is Patricia Westbrook Chen, and my father, Harold Westbrook, died under suspicious circumstances in Richmond, Virginia, 15 years ago. His new wife at the time was Delilah Morrison, and his stepchildren were Jasper and Melody Thornfield, the same people who are now claiming inheritance rights in this family. The room fell completely silent. Everyone was staring at Delilah, who looked like she might faint. My father died of a medication overdose 1 week after changing his will to include his stepchildren, Patricia continued. He left behind a recording expressing fears that his wife and her lawyer brother-in-law were planning to kill him. That lawyer was Richard Morrison. Morrison made a desperate attempt to discredit her. This is a coordinated attack by disgruntled family members trying to... Actually, I interrupted, pulling out my phone. It's a federal investigation into a multi-state inheritance fraud scheme. Agent Novak, I think it's time. On cue, Agent Patricia Novak stepped out from behind the parlor's heavy curtains, her FBI badge clearly visible. 2 other agents emerged from the kitchen and positioned themselves near the exits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Novak announced, "I'm Special Agent Patricia Novak with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're currently conducting an investigation into inheritance fraud, identity theft, and suspected homicide in connection with the deaths of Harold Westbrook and Lydia Rosewood." The room erupted in shocked gasps and excited whispers. Several people pulled out their phones to start recording, but Agent Novak raised her hand for silence. "Delilah Morrison and Richard Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, falsification of legal documents, and suspicion of homicide in connection with the deaths of Harold Westbrook and Lydia Rosewood." As the agents moved in to make the arrests, Delilah made one last desperate play. "You can't prove anything," she screamed. "You have no evidence!" I smiled and pulled out the manila folder that contained my mother's final letter. "Actually, my mother documented everything 15 years ago. She knew exactly what you were planning, and she made sure the evidence would survive even if she didn't." Morrison tried to run, but Agent Novak's partner caught him before he reached the front door. As they cuffed him, he shouted at me with pure hatred, "You have no idea what you've unleashed. There are others." "Yes," Agent Novak said calmly, "we know about the others. And thanks to tonight's performance, we now have everything we need to bring down your entire organization." As federal agents led Delilah and Morrison away in handcuffs, the assembled crowd of Millbrook's elite stood in stunned silence. The birthday party that was supposed to destroy my reputation had instead exposed a criminal conspiracy that had been operating under their noses for decades. Judge Blackwood was the first to break the silence. "Amber, my dear, it appears congratulations are in order, not only for your birthday, but for your courage in seeking justice for your mother and countless other victims." I looked around the room at faces that showed everything from shock to admiration to respect. These were people who'd watched me grow up in the shadow of suspicion and manipulation, and now they were seeing me for who I really was, Lydia Rosewood's daughter, with her strength, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to truth. The scared, compliant girl they'd expected to humiliate was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had just proven that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The mansion fell silent except for the sound of handcuffs clicking and the shuffle of federal agents escorting Delilah and Morrison toward the front door. But as they reached the grand foyer, Delilah suddenly broke free from her escort and whirled around to face me, her carefully composed mask finally shattering completely. "You sanctimonious little bitch," she snarled, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "You think you've won something? You have no idea what your precious mother really was." Agent Novak moved to restrain her, but I held up my hand. "Let her talk. I want everyone to hear what she has to say." The party guests had followed us into the foyer, forming a semicircle of shocked faces in expensive clothes. Judge Blackwood positioned himself near the front, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of what was clearly about to become a dramatic confession. Delilah's composure cracked like a broken dam. "Your mother wasn't the saint everyone thinks she was. She was a cold, calculating woman who destroyed my first family, who ruined my life, and who deserved everything that happened to her." "What are you talking about?" Kenneth demanded, stepping forward with confusion written across his face. "Tell them, Delilah," I said quietly, pulling out another document from my mother's evidence collection. "Tell them about Crystal Vaughn." The name hit Delilah like a physical blow. Her face went white, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. Morrison, still in handcuffs, was shaking his head frantically, trying to signal her to stay quiet. But it was too late. The dam had burst.
"Crystal was my sister," Delilah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My baby sister, who was sweet and trusting and believed in people, until she met your mother's precious first husband." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Kenneth's face showed complete bewilderment. Lydia's first husband? What first husband? I looked at my mother's private investigator report.
the one that had revealed far more family secrets than I'd initially realized. My mother was married before she met Kenneth, to a man named David Vaughn. He was Crystal's husband and the biological father of Jasper and Melody. Delilah laughed bitterly. Oh, she was married to him all right up until she decided she wanted something better, someone richer, someone who could give her the life she thought she deserved. Dr. Warner stepped forward, her face pale with realization. The pregnancy Lydia lost before Amber was born, that wasn't a miscarriage, was it? It was a choice, Delilah spat. Your precious Lydia Rosewood got pregnant with David while she was already planning to leave him for Kenneth. She couldn't risk Kenneth finding out about the pregnancy, so she got rid of it, told David she'd lost the baby in an accident. Kenneth's legs seemed to give out. He gripped the banister for support. That's not possible. Lydia would never... Wouldn't she? Delilah's voice raised to a shriek. She destroyed David, told him she lost their baby, then disappeared with half their joint assets. David never recovered. He started drinking, lost his job, couldn't pay child support for Jasper and Melody. Crystal had to work 3 jobs to support those kids alone. Morrison was desperately trying to get Delilah's attention, but she was lost in 15 years of suppressed rage and grief. And then Crystal got sick. Cancer. No insurance, no money for treatment, because David couldn't even pay his basic bills after your mother destroyed him financially. Crystal died when the twins were 4 years old, leaving them orphans. Patricia Westbrook Chen had been recording everything on her phone. So you and Morrison took in your sister's children and started planning revenge. We planned justice, Delilah corrected fiercely. Your mother stole everything from my family. She killed Crystal as surely as if she put a gun to her head. So yes, we planned to take everything from her daughter. It seemed appropriate. Judge Blackwood stepped forward, his voice heavy with authority. Mrs. Morrison, you're confessing to a 15-year conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud and murder. I strongly advise you to remain silent until you have legal representation. But Delilah was beyond caring about legal advice. Murder? You want to know about murder? Your mother figured out who we were 3 months after Kenneth married me. She recognized the twins' resemblance to David and started investigating. But instead of confronting us, she decided to gather evidence to destroy us quietly. Agent Novak was frantically signaling her team to keep recording as Delilah laid out the entire conspiracy. She hired that private investigator, collected documents, built a case against us, but she made one mistake. She told David she'd found her children. She wanted to arrange supervised visits, wanted to ease her guilty conscience by reconnecting him with Jasper and Melody. Kenneth's voice was barely a whisper. She was trying to do the right thing. She was trying to save herself, because David had evidence of what she'd done. Medical records proving she'd terminated their pregnancy voluntarily, financial documents showing how she'd stolen from their joint accounts, photos of her with Kenneth while she was still married to David. Morrison was finally finding his voice. Delilah, stop talking. You're making this worse. Worse? How could it be worse? We're going to prison anyway. At least now everyone knows the truth about their precious Lydia Rosewood. Dr. Warner stepped forward, her medical training taking over. Even if everything you're saying is true, that doesn't justify murder. We didn't plan to kill her, Delilah said, her voice growing quieter. We just wanted the evidence David had. We arranged to meet her that night at the old bridge outside town. We were going to trade David's evidence for a share of the Rosewood fortune. Agent Novak moved closer, sensing this was the crucial confession. What happened at that meeting? She came alone, just like we asked, but she'd brought copies of everything. She told us she was going to the FBI the next morning, that she'd already contacted the authorities about Harold Westbrook's death. She knew about Richmond.
She knew everything. The room was completely silent now, except for Delilah's broken voice and the distant sound of sirens approaching, backup units summoned by Agent Novak's team.
Kenneth made a sound like a wounded animal. You left her there to die. She was already dead, Delilah whispered. We checked. There was nothing we could do. So we made it look like an accident. Put her in the car, sent it off the road into the ravine. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the silence like a blade. You staged a car accident to cover up a murder? It wasn't murder, Delilah screamed. It was an accident. We just wanted justice for Crystal and the children. Morrison had given up trying to silence her. His shoulders sagged in defeat as he realized their 15-year secret was now public record, witnessed by 60 of Millbrook's most influential citizens and recorded by federal agents. Agent Novak stepped forward to rearrest them both. Delilah Morrison and Richard Morrison, in addition to the previous charges, you are now under arrest for the murder of Lydia Rosewood and conspiracy to obstruct justice. As they read the Miranda rights, I stood watching the collapse of the people who had destroyed my family, but instead of satisfaction, I felt only a hollow emptiness. Nothing they confessed tonight would bring my mother back. Nothing would undo 15 years of manipulation and lies. Jasper and Melody had been standing frozen throughout their mother's confession, watching their entire world implode. They weren't the masterminds. They were victims too, caught in a web of adult vengeance that had shaped their entire lives. But as the federal agents led Delilah and Morrison away for the final time, I realized something important. The truth wasn't always justice, but it was always powerful. And tonight, after 15 years of living with lies, the truth had finally set us all free, even if freedom felt more complicated than I'd expected it to be. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, watching as Judge Margaret Henley delivered the final sentences in what had become known as the Rosewood inheritance murders. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, FBI agents, journalists, and curious onlookers who'd followed the case through months of shocking revelations and legal proceedings. Delilah Morrison stood before the bench in an orange jumpsuit, her platinum hair now showing gray roots and her face bearing the weight of someone who'd finally run out of lies to tell. The transformation from the confident woman who'd once ruled my family's dinner table was complete and devastating. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Henley said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the federal bench, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, inheritance fraud across state lines, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and racketeering. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Delilah's knees buckled. The bailiff caught her before she fell, but she made no sound. No crying, no protests, just the hollow stare of someone whose 15-year house of cards had finally collapsed completely. Richard Morrison's sentencing had taken place the week before. As the mastermind of the inheritance fraud scheme that had operated across 7 states and claimed at least 4 lives, he'd received 2 consecutive life sentences plus 40 years. The judge had been particularly harsh after the prosecution revealed that Morrison was planning to target a wealthy widow in California before their arrest, with Delilah already positioned as the grieving neighbor ready to offer support. Agent Novak sat beside me in the courtroom, having become an unexpected friend during the months of investigation and trials. The federal task force identified 12 other potential victims, she whispered as court officers led Delilah away. Morrison's law firm had been studying inheritance patterns and targeting lonely widowers for 23 years. You stopped a machine that had been killing people for decades.
David Vaughn had died 3 months into the investigation, found in his Richmond apartment by police conducting a welfare check. The official cause of death was liver failure from chronic alcoholism, but those of us who knew the full story understood that he'd been dying slowly for 15 years, ever since my mother's actions had destroyed his will to live. In a strange way, Delilah's confession had freed him to finally stop fighting the guilt and grief that had consumed him. Patricia Westbrook Chen had sued Morrison's law firm for wrongful death and recovered $12 million that her father's estate had lost to the conspiracy. She'd used part of the settlement to establish the Harold Westbrook Foundation for Victims of Inheritance Fraud, which was already helping families in similar situations across the country. The financial resolution of my own case had been surprisingly straightforward once the criminal proceedings concluded. Thomas Ashford at First National Bank had efficiently transferred all Rosewood assets into my sole control, with the irrevocable trust protections ensuring that no future challenges could threaten the inheritance. The final accounting revealed that my mother's careful financial planning had grown the estate to nearly $150 million, a fortune that Delilah and Morrison had been systematically planning to steal.
Kenneth had voluntarily undergone psychological counseling to understand how he'd been manipulated for 15 years. Dr. Elizabeth Warner had recommended a specialist in psychological abuse who helped him recognize the gaslighting techniques Delilah had used to isolate me from him and from his own instincts. During our weekly sessions together, he'd gradually become the father I remembered from childhood, the man who'd loved my mother genuinely and who'd wanted to protect me before Delilah poisoned his mind against me. "I'll never forgive myself for doubting you," he said during one particularly difficult session. "Your mother trusted me to protect you, and I let a sociopath convince me you were the threat." The most complex part of the resolution involved Jasper and Melody. As orphans who'd been raised in a criminal conspiracy without understanding the truth, they occupied a unique position. Legally innocent, but practically complicit in crimes that had destroyed multiple families. The twins had testified against Delilah and Morrison in exchange for immunity, their testimony providing crucial details about the family's planning sessions and the evidence destruction attempts. Child Services had originally planned to place them in foster care, but at 22, they were technically adults who'd been living independently since their arrests. Patricia and I had worked together to establish a supervised reintegration program that provided them with counseling, education funding, and job placement assistance, while ensuring they had no access to any inherited wealth they weren't entitled to. Jasper had been the most affected by learning the truth about his identity, discovering that the man he'd called father for 15 years wasn't related to him, that his entire life story was fabricated, and that his mother figure was a murderer had triggered a complete psychological breakdown. He'd spent 3 months in inpatient psychiatric care before beginning the slow process of rebuilding his sense of self. Melody had adapted more quickly, perhaps because she'd always been more observant about the inconsistencies in their family story. She'd enrolled in community college and was studying social work, hoping to help other children caught in situations similar to her own. We met for coffee occasionally, not as family, but as two people who'd survived the same traumatic situation and were trying to make sense of what remained. "I keep thinking about all the family dinners where we planned to humiliate you," she said during one of our meetings. "We were so cruel, and we didn't even understand why. Delilah just told us you were selfish and ungrateful, and we believed her because she was the only mother we remembered." The legal proceedings had also revealed the true scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise. Federal investigators had identified connections to inheritance fraud cases dating back to the 1990s, with at least 17 suspicious deaths linked to his network of associates. The Richmond case had just been one operation in a much larger criminal organization that had stolen an estimated $200 million from families across the country.
The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Sarah Blackwell's original article for the Millbrook Herald had been picked up by national news outlets, and for several months I'd been known as the DNA daughter who exposed a serial inheritance scam. Book publishers and documentary filmmakers had approached me about telling my story, but I'd turned them all down. Some stories were too personal to commoditize, and I had no interest in profiting from other people's tragedies. The most satisfying resolution had come through the establishment of the Lydia Rosewood Foundation for Financial Crime Victims. Using $20 million from the recovered inheritance, we'd created a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support to families targeted by inheritance fraud. The foundation had already helped over 300 families and had successfully prevented 12 other inheritance scams from succeeding. Dr. Warner served as the foundation's medical director, providing psychiatric care for victims of financial manipulation and family abuse. Rebecca Hartwell had taken over the marketing and public relations efforts, using her agency's resources to raise awareness about inheritance fraud warning signs. Judge Blackwood had agreed to serve on the legal advisory board, lending his considerable reputation to the foundation's advocacy efforts. As I walked out of the Richmond courthouse after Delilah's sentencing, Agent Novak handed me a folder containing the final FBI report on the case. "Thought you might want to see the complete picture," she said. "Your mother's investigation was what broke this whole thing open. Even from beyond the grave, she saved a lot of lives." That evening, I drove to Millbrook Cemetery for the first time since my mother's funeral. Her grave was marked with a simple granite headstone that read, "Lydia Catherine Rosewood, beloved mother and protector." I'd ordered a second inscription added after the trials concluded. "Her truth prevailed."
Standing there in the gathering dusk, I finally felt the peace that had eluded me throughout the investigation and trials. Justice hadn't been simple or clean. Delilah and Morrison would spend their lives in prison, but David Vaughn was dead, and the Rosewood family was forever changed by the revelations about my mother's past. But the truth had finally been told. The victims had been acknowledged, and the criminal conspiracy that had operated in shadows for decades had been permanently destroyed. Most importantly, I'd learned that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about making sure the next potential victim never becomes a victim at all. 2 years after that devastating family dinner that changed everything, I stood in the conference room of the newly constructed Lydia Rosewood Center for Family Justice, looking out at 43 women who had gathered from across the country for our annual Survivors Conference. Their faces reflected every stage of the journey I knew intimately, from the fresh shock of betrayal to the hard-won strength that comes from fighting for truth and winning. The center occupied a beautiful modern building in downtown Millbrook, just 3 blocks from the courthouse where Delilah and Morrison had been sentenced. The symbolism wasn't accidental. I wanted other families facing inheritance fraud to know that justice was possible, that truth could prevail, and that they weren't alone in their fight. Sarah Blackwell, now the center's director of communications, introduced me to the assembled group. "Ladies, please welcome someone who needs no introduction to those of us who followed inheritance fraud cases. Amber Rosewood, whose courage in exposing a multi-generational criminal conspiracy has saved countless families from similar devastation." The applause was warm but restrained. These women understood that survival wasn't something to celebrate lightly. It was something to honor, to learn from, and to use as a foundation for helping others. "Thank you all for being here," I began, settling into the comfortable rhythm I'd developed over 2 years of speaking to survivor groups. "I want to start by saying something that might surprise you. I don't consider myself a hero.
I consider myself someone who got angry enough to stop accepting lies as truth. A woman in the front row, probably in her 60s, with silver hair and determined eyes, nodded emphatically. I'd learned that the nod of recognition was universal among financial abuse survivors. The moment when someone else's story resonated with your own experience. 2.5 years ago, I was living a life built on other people's definitions of who I was supposed to be. I was the grateful stepdaughter who should be happy with whatever scraps the family threw my way. I was the young woman who should accept being treated as less than because speaking up would be disruptive. I was the daughter who should believe that her own mother had somehow failed her by dying too soon to protect her. Dr. Warner, who now served as the center's clinical director, sat in the back of the room taking notes. We'd discovered that survivor stories contained patterns that helped us identify families at risk and develop intervention strategies. My story had become a case study in how inheritance fraud perpetrators used emotional manipulation and family dynamics to achieve their goals. The turning point for me wasn't the DNA test results, though those were certainly dramatic. The turning point was when I realized that silence wasn't protecting my family, it was enabling the people who were destroying it. When you stop speaking your truth to keep the peace, you're not maintaining peace. You're maintaining someone else's power over you. A younger woman near the middle of the room raised her hand. How did you know when to trust your instincts? I keep second-guessing myself, wondering if I'm being paranoid or ungrateful. It was a question I heard at every speaking engagement, and one that went to the heart of psychological manipulation. Trust is about consistency between words and actions. People who love you don't systematically exclude you from family decisions. They don't make you feel grateful for basic respect, and they certainly don't ask you to accept being erased from your own family history. Over the past 2 years, the center had helped 847 families navigate inheritance disputes, financial fraud cases, and family manipulation situations. We'd prevented an estimated 43 inheritance fraud schemes from succeeding and had helped recover over $60 million in stolen assets. But the numbers only told part of the story.
Rebecca Hartwell had joined me in building the center's outreach programs, using her marketing expertise to raise awareness about the warning signs of inheritance fraud. The most important thing we've learned, she often said, is that these crimes thrive in silence. The moment families start talking openly about their concerns, the criminals lose their power. Kenneth had become one of our most effective advocates, speaking to groups of potential targets about how psychological manipulation works. His transformation from victim to educator had been remarkable to witness. I spent 15 years thinking I was protecting my family by keeping secrets, he would tell audiences. What I was really doing was protecting the people who were robbing my daughter blind. The relationship between Kenneth and me had stabilized into something honest and functional, if not entirely healed. We had dinner every few weeks, during which we talked about the foundation's work, current events, and occasionally memories of my mother that weren't tainted by Delilah's lies. The easy father-daughter relationship of my childhood was gone forever, but what had replaced it was built on truth rather than manipulation. "Can you talk about forgiveness?" asked a woman whose story I knew. Her stepchildren had stolen her inheritance and left her homeless at 72. "Everyone keeps telling me I need to forgive to move on, but I'm not sure I want to." I considered my answer carefully. "Forgiveness isn't a requirement for healing," I said. "Understanding is. I understand now that Delilah's actions came from her grief over her sister's death and her rage at my mother's role in that tragedy. Understanding doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps me make sense of why she did it. That understanding has been more valuable to me than forgiveness." Jasper had surprised everyone by becoming a volunteer at the center, helping with technology and administrative tasks while continuing his psychology studies. His journey from co-conspirator to ally had been difficult to watch, but ultimately redemptive.
He'd never regained the 15 years of identity that had been stolen from him, but he'd found purpose in preventing other young people from being used as unwitting weapons in family warfare. Melody had chosen a different path, moving to Oregon and working with a nonprofit that helped children navigate foster care systems. We exchanged Christmas cards and occasional emails, but she decided that distance from everything connected to the Rosewood case was necessary for her healing. I respected that choice, understanding that survival looks different for everyone. What would you tell your younger self if you could go back to that moment when everything started falling apart? Asked the silver-haired woman from the front row. I smiled, thinking about the terrified young woman who'd sat in her car outside a small cafe, staring at empty bank statements and wondering how her life had gone so wrong. I'd tell her that being alone isn't the same as being powerless, that the people trying to convince you you're weak are usually the ones who are most afraid of your strength, and that the truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always more powerful than lies. After the session ended, participants gathered in small groups around the conference room, sharing stories and contact information, forming networks of support that were crucial for long-term healing. Dr. Warner circulated among them, offering resources and referrals for continued counseling and legal assistance. Agent Novak, who now led the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force and served on our advisory board, pulled me aside as the room began to empty. I wanted you to know we just arrested another inheritance fraud ring in Arizona. They were using the Morrison playbook almost exactly, but the victims recognized the warning signs because of your foundation's awareness campaign. 3 elderly widowers and about $12 million in assets saved. As I drove home that evening to the modest house I'd bought in Millbrook's historic district, a place chosen for its character rather than its size, I reflected on how profoundly my definition of success had changed. 2 years ago, I'd measured my worth by how well I could avoid conflict and keep others happy. Now I measured it by how many people I could help find their own voices and fight their own battles. The Riverside mansion sat empty now, too large and too full of painful memories to ever feel like home again. I donated it to the city for use as a community center, with the stipulation that it housed programs for at-risk families and financial literacy education. Delilah's dream palace had become a place where people learned to protect themselves from people like her. My mother's portrait still hung in my living room, but I'd had the inscription changed. Instead of the dates of her birth and death, it now read, Lydia Catherine Rosewood. She taught her daughter to fight back. Because in the end, that was the most valuable inheritance she'd left me. Not the money, not the property, but the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win.
Tomorrow, I would return to the center, where more families would call seeking help, where more survivors would share their stories, and where the work of turning pain into purpose would continue. It wasn't the life I'd planned at 25, but it was the life I'd chosen at 27. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let your story end where someone else wanted it to. Sometimes survival means taking what tried to destroy you and using it to protect others. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's making sure the people who hurt you never get the chance to hurt anyone else the same way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.